Good to go.
All right. Is my mic on? Hello? Is it on? Okay. All right. Welcome to board meeting study session. Today is Tuesday, November 15th, 2022. We're going to officially call this meeting to order and start with introductions. Let's begin with Terry.
Terry Bodden.
Connie Burgess.
Nicole McDermott.
Chris Wynn.
Clark Nelson.
Rich Nye.
And Karen Winder, board chair. All right, welcome everybody. We're glad to have you with us and those listening online. Our first item of business is actually a fun thing. We have hired a new business administrator, Todd Haber, and we are excited to welcome him to the Granite team. He's replacing Dave Garrett. So we're going to make this official. His start date was October 17th, I think officially, but we're going to go ahead and administer his oath of office. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go. Ben? Anybody? Oh. Actually, grab. Yeah. I don't know how you're going to do this and raise your arm to the square. All right, there we go. All right, so repeat after me. I, Todd Haber,
I, Todd Haber,
having been appointed to the office
having been appointed to the office
of Business Administrator Treasurer of Granite School District,
of Business Administrator Treasurer of Granite School District,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support, obey, and defend
that I will support, obey, and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Utah,
and the Constitution of the State of Utah,
and that I will discharge the duties of my office
and that I will discharge the duties of my office
with fidelity.
with fidelity.
Awesome. Well, this one for you. There you go. Congratulations. Okay, do you have a pen tag? Okay, perfect. We'll get that.
Todd, do you need a pen?
Oh, Dr. Wilson saves the day.
It's a Title I pen. I need that back.
Just sanitize it. All right. Next on our agenda, we have a Title I update. We're going to turn the time over. Not Joan, right? Dr. Wilson. Okay, Dr. Wilson today to provide us a Title I update, and then we'll open it up for discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Board. I realize that I only wear this jacket once a year when I present to you, so it's a little dusty, but looking forward. Or I could take it, get it dry cleaned. That might be a better option. No, I appreciate your time today as we're going to have an update on Title I going on in Granite School District. I thought to start off, it would be appropriate to remind us what the statutory purpose is of Title I. Each funding source has a purpose that guides how it should be spent and used. And that's to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close educational achievement gaps. Now, there are a lot of rules how Title I funding should be spent, decision points that govern how we should classify schools or declassify them. And no matter what flexibility that we use or decisions that we make, a guiding principle is below. Each district, in deciding what eligible schools to serve, we must make sure that each school receives enough Title I funding to effectively operate a Title I program. So the schools that we do serve, that should be our guiding star. Now, I wanted to add something into this annual presentation that I haven't done before, and I'm excited about this. I wanted to spotlight some efforts in a few of our Title I schools. Now, all 27 of our Title I schools are doing it. There's amazing things happening in each of those buildings. But I wanted to spotlight Gorley, Silver Hills, Western Hills, and Wilson, because each of those four schools, within a few years ago, they either had an F letter grade, or they were an alert school, or a turnaround school. And to see them now make some progress where each of them received a B letter grade, it shows remarkable growth, and I think that should be celebrated. And so what Joan did, so Dr. Bramble and myself, we conducted a focus group. We talked with these principals, and we said, hey, each of you have a similar journey. To what would you ascribe your school success. And in their own words, they each gave an answer that I've summarized on the right, that they focus on recruitment and retention. They have a lens singular to building the capacity of their people, giving them great instructional feedback, reflections, so that there's a culture of professional learning in the building, that if I'm a teacher in those schools, I'm going to be better so that I'm better for my kids. Doing the right things, there's great systems in place, effective PLCs, student interventions at work using our district tools and framework. And then it's done in the right way. So in Title I schools, there's a requirement to use the logic model in planning, which we've expanded to all of our schools in this continual improvement process. But in essence, we must make decisions based off of data and use evidence-based practices. I love that each of those schools said, we're not done, we're going to get that A next year. And I also noted that each of them said, you know, this was a journey. We couldn't have done this in 1 year. It took several years of these sustained efforts to make sure we got to this point. And that resonates with implementation science. You have the right tools in place, and you don't see results right away. It builds over time to about that 3 to 5 year mark. We really see some of these things come to fruition. And so we're proud of all of our schools, but wanted to celebrate these 4 in particular as we talk about some other matters relating to Title I and how things might circle back to, in conversation, to the work of these 4 schools. Keeping in mind that the statutory purpose of Title I is to close achievement gaps, and then also keeping in mind the conclusion of the last 2 times that I presented to you is it's not the money itself that yields outcomes. As we look to return on investment, we can't equate increased dollar amounts always equates to increased student outcomes because of where schools are in that process of improving over time. But it's still helpful and good to know how schools are spending their allocations. And so when you see the elementary column, that's the aggregate of the 22 elementary schools, and then the 3 junior high schools, and then the 2 high schools. So I don't know, it would bear further discussion, but I have this as reference that if we wanted to refer back to it, we could in this presentation. Now, I wanted to talk about, first, a reminder of the unique ways that we calculate poverty in our high schools, and then give some 2 updates because there are at least 2 salient updates that pertain to how we should think about Title I in our high schools. First, a reminder that we determine how we rank and serve Title I schools according to their levels of poverty. Now, we choose free lunch, but we all have, for 10 years or so now, exercised the option to calculate poverty for our high schools, not according to their own students that turn in free lunch forms, but we use a projection from their elementary feeder schools. That's called an elementary projected feeder pattern. And so it's a proxy measure of poverty for our high schools. And the second that is something unique that pertains to Cottonwood High School is 5 of our elementary schools receive a free lunch grant. That means even though not 100% of the students in those 5 elementary schools are in poverty, there's enough poverty in the school that all of the students eat lunch for free, and that's a wonderful opportunity for these students. What it does is it increases their poverty to what it actually is, and Cottonwood becomes doubly benefited from that because, well, they count their elementary school poverty, not their own, and the elementary poverty is more than it would because of this grant. And so we'll see in a few slides down the difference between what you might expect from Cottonwood and the actual because of those 2 funding mechanisms. Now,
Aaron, can I just interrupt? Just for the record, we have Board Member Julie Jackson joined us a little bit late, but she's here.
Wonderful. Now, I collaborate with all of the Title I principals in large or small group settings. I have individual meetings with 2 administrators each month from our high schools. And we've been focusing on a high school initiative that, in my opinion, better uses Title I funding than they have in the past. In fairness to high schools, the Title I regulations are really written so that they tend to focus more on early literacy and early numeracy. Title I historically has focused on those younger grade levels because it's easier to close learning gaps. So it's kind of been hard for high schools to have a handle to grab onto in meeting the statutory purpose. But we've partnered with CTE and are seeking business partners and using the way the statutory purpose of Title I to prepare them for college and beyond, and starting a cohort model with freshmen, using a two-generation parent approach so that parents and students are going to be learning skills side by side. And it's in the planning phases, but what's been exciting to see is how for the Title I schools this year, as they've really unpacked or deconstructed, well, what does Title I mean for a high school? There's some neat innovation that's starting and some neat planning that I didn't report on last year because it's new since we last met. The last new thing, and you'll recall last year I showed the chart that I made explaining to my kids if they could have a snack or not, and that's how my mind works, this kind of decision flow charts. Well, this is an actual one that I summarized from the Department of Ed. It's the rule sets that determine how we can serve Title I schools and how much money we can give them. Since we last met, I received updates from the federal government, and there was one change which works in our favor in terms of giving us some flexibility in thinking about how we could fund Title I high schools. And it's the part that's crossed off. For years we've said, man, it would be nice if we could keep Title I high schools but give them less money. Well, we actually have more discretion. The rule set didn't allow us to up to now, but we do have that discretion. And when I got this notice, I reached out to the state. I said, is this true? And they said, yeah, that is true. I informed them that the change had taken place. So there's two updates for Title I as pertaining to high schools that we didn't have last year when I presented to you. As a reminder, we have 22 elementary schools currently that are Title I, 3 junior highs, and 2 high schools, and they're listed here. All right. Now, I tried to summarize a bunch of information in this slide. It's pretty busy. The schools that have kind of the orange coloring on the left, those are the ones that are currently Title I schools. And it's ranked from most impoverished to least impoverished. And then I stopped at Silver Hills because that's the least impoverished Title I schools. Now, the free lunch percentages on the right column, they're ranked according to poverty, but according to preliminary projections that are not yet finalized, those will be finalized in December, but there's not much change from now to then. So it might change slightly, but not a lot. These are the preliminary numbers that we have. We'll base final decisions off of the December 1 poverty counts. The 5 elementary schools and the 1 junior high school that benefit from the community eligibility, the free lunch grant, their poverty percentages are in red. Something I think is quite interesting in this is the purple text. It shows poverty broken out by the 3 high schools here, their actual poverty on the left, and then what happens when we use their elementary school. And you'll see that it's quite a variance from Cottonwood, about 30%. Less variance when we look at Granger and then Hunter's in between. So I notice a few things here that as we're looking ahead to next year and wonder, well, what schools should be qualified for Title I, we see that, as happens, it usually doesn't happen this much, but Silver Hills has fallen out of that ranking. And they actually fell out of the ranking just before the pandemic, but they've been living on borrowed time because the pandemic led us to freeze the schools that were being served. And so they've been a bubble school for 3 or 4 years now. And I've been working with Principal Sonnenreich, and she's been making sure that parents or families in the community have been filling out those forms. And she's was put on notice that, well, it's likely the case that you'll lose Title I funding because you've fallen out of that rank order. And by 5 schools, that's, to me, an indication that the poverty in that community has changed over time, meaning that it would no longer be eligible for Title I funding because it's fallen out so large. And I want to refer back to the slide, but a good reminder for us is Title I funding changed drastically from the 21-22 year to this current year. And as a reminder, there's an important reason for that. when the federal government gives states their money, said here's the Title I money that you can distribute to your districts, they compare states to each other. And because Utah did relatively well in the pandemic, even though the federal government gave hundreds of millions more across the country, Utah got 13 million less, and Granite got $1.3 million less. It's important to know that it's not looking like this will rebound anytime soon because our economy relative to others is looking good. So it looks like the amount that we had, that 15.5 million, it's not looking like we'll go back up to that anytime soon. And we don't know what our allocation for this next school year will be. It comes out in March or April. We're not expecting it to go above what we have. So all leading to, a painful reality that we have at least one school that will likely be declassified from Title I status, Silver Hills, and I've had conversations with the principal to help think of how to prepare for that, et cetera. But as I've shared these reminders about the frozen poverty rates during the pandemic, and that there is some natural fluctuation that occurs. We haven't always served the same Title I schools over time. For example, Pleasant Green was once a Title I school, but their poverty changed, and they haven't been a Title I school for about 10 years or so. Now, as we continue to grapple with the question, well, how do we make sure that we're meeting the statutory purpose of Title I funding, that whatever schools we do provide this funding, that's enough to close the learning gaps in their building? So I'm framing 3 ways to think about it, or 3 options to consider. The first is, well, we can do what we've always done when we didn't have as much flexibility as before, and maintain our 2 eligible high schools as Title I, and give them their full PPA as we have. So that's an option that we currently exercising, right? So that would be, I suppose you could rename option 1 as kind of the status quo or no change. Now, option 2 is, well, we have more flexibility now. We could continue to fund high schools, but we get to decide what PPA would be most appropriate, keeping in mind that high schools benefit from an economy of scale that a small elementary school wouldn't. And so less money could go a little further than the same money given to an elementary school. So that's what the second option entails, and we'll show some forecasting in a moment. The third and last option could be, well, let's no longer fund the high schools and focus the funds in the elementary and junior high ranks. And so I'll go through some modeling of what that will look like right now. So if option 1, if we continue to fund high schools at the similar PPA, now every schools would go down because, recall, 21-22 was our last good year of Title I funding, then it went down. And next year, if we keep the same allocation that we did next year to this year, those 26 schools, remember Silver Hills we're not considering, we'd go down by an average of 20% compared to that 21-22 year. Now, the Title I schools haven't really felt the pain of the $1.3 million losses because we've helped them maintain their staffing through ESSER funding. And that should be considered in these 3 options is, well, we probably shouldn't think of this current year as our baseline, because when ESSER goes away, if we don't make any change, then some of these Title I schools will have to reduce staffing, surplus, et cetera, because that 1.3 we've been able to save them, and we can't do that any longer. And that's what this last point is ESSER funds are made available to these schools to maintain staffing. Now, so this is the status quo. As we talk about option 2, what if we continue to fund the high schools, but we exercise our ability to give them a lower PPA? So we wouldn't add any schools necessarily. And for modeling purposes, I said, well, what if we went, currently they're getting about $260 per student in poverty. What if we lowered that to like $10 a student, right? Well, what that would mean is the 24 other schools, if we compare to that last good funding year of 2021-2022, it's still down about 13.5%. Well, but if we compare it to the year that we're in, it's up. Well, again, this year is hard for even schools to have context because they're staying afloat through ESSER funding. So I put your focus to that 13.5% decrease, that if we continue to fund these two high schools but at a lower PPA, when ESSER funding goes away, it still means that these elementary schools will have to make cuts because we even lowering that high school PPA that much doesn't account for that $1.3 million loss. The third way to think about this, or that I'm framing the conversation, well, what would happen if we no longer funded these high schools? Well, by federal statute, they would be able to maintain the technology that they purchased with Title I funds, et cetera. If they lost their funding, well, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that we absorb almost all of that $1.3 million loss. That if we compare what the remaining 26 schools would have compared to that 21-22 year, it makes up for 97% of the loss, or all but 3%. Now again, if we compare it to this current year, well, allocations would go up. Well, not really, because ESSER's been keeping us afloat. And so, and it was fun running all these numbers, and to kind of put it simply in terms of a percentage. The percentage, that you don't average an average, so when I say average of 3%, that percentage number was the median. So a table summary is option one, the status quo. Allocations would go down across the board by an average of 20%. If we decrease the PPA from 260 to about 10 in each high schools, the allocations are still down 14%. We still need to make surplus or other program cuts in the existing Title I schools because of that $1.3 million deficit. Or if we don't fund the high schools, well, we've almost made up for that $1.3 million loss. And that's how I framed the conversation. I, of course, love eyes on it perspective questions, as these are important considerations to be made.
One question I had when reading this earlier was, is there a point, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but when we talked last year or whenever it was, a year and a half ago, about, do we keep it in elementary or do we leave it in high school? We talked about kind of the efficacy of the dollar, meaning, is there a point where if we reduce the high school, so they're getting $10 a student or whatever the number is there a point where it really doesn't make a difference because that number is so low? And then, because that's something we need to consider is, when do we reach a point where it's, we're not going to gain any efficacy with those funds?
Yeah, and that breaking point or that hinge point could be considered both at what we give the high schools and what we're giving the elementaries, right? And so it's true that, in my belief, that high schools have the economy of scale where they can do more with less, right? But you're right. If we did give high schools $10 per student in poverty, my concern or bias there as well, however we fund the high school, we need to make sure it's sufficient to close poverty gaps, right? And so that's our guiding star. And I can't speak to that entirely, but I do believe it would be, that is a more equitable, if we wanted to treat elementary and high school the same, not consider the national trends of, well, it's easier or quicker to invest resources in a younger student than otherwise. If we are kind of blind to that and we consider what is more equitable funding, it is option two becomes more viable because it kind of levels the playing field a little bit between elementary and secondary. But I'll preface, no option here is great. There's no one winner in the three options that are being explored today.
Because I'm thinking of Granger that's sitting at 3,500 kids. $10 a kid, they get $35,000.
Yeah.
That's not even, a half a teacher? 35 is half, well, it's a little over half. But my point is it wouldn't even,
Right. Well,
for their discretionary use to look at those funds, how much, when you have 3,500 kids in your classroom, goodness, not a classroom, in a school building, and then you have $35,000 to work with. I'm just wondering, does that even... I shouldn't say it matters because that makes it sound like I don't care about $35,000, and I do.
Yeah, you'd end up having more, but there's other things to note. When prior to giving allocations to schools, we look at district set-asides, things that we'd fund to all schools. So not coming out of that allocation for Grangers, I provide to them an instructional coach, right? And then some professional learning that comes from my district budget for teachers. So there are some fringe benefits not associated with their allocation, but to your point, yes, you can't do as much with less money, but what I'd also say is that our high schools still have access now of ESSER and then TSSA and Land Trust, right? And they have the economy of scale of those funding sources that even though those are still allocated to elementary schools on a PPA, it's high schools have more buying power with other funding sources available to them.
And they have the ability with that 35,000, they don't have to buy a teacher, they can buy an extra period, which is often what happens. And that 35,000 can be extended a lot more through a secondary school than it can an elementary.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm just throwing that 35,000 out just to kind of put a dollar amount to wrap our minds around. I mean, that was obviously Title I. Nicole's right. They can use it to buy periods, make that dollar stretch more. It's just something for the board to kind of think about.
My question is, Granger is our biggest high school and Cottonwood's our smallest.
Yeah,
And so that money, if it's the same dollar amount, is going to probably feel different in each of those high schools.
Those two high schools have different, they're different, right? Even though they both share currently label of Title I, different needs, different scales there as well. You're right.
But they would not receive the same amount, correct? Because it's a per pupil allocation.
Right, per student that lives in poverty. And so I'll go back to that slide here. And so we'd have to go by the number of students that live in poverty. So it would be the purple number, if you will. What works in Cottonwood's favor, though, is because of that projected feeder pattern, this kind of helps them so they don't feel as small when we calculate poverty in that way. So really it's only a difference of 900 students where it could be a difference of over 1,000.
So I'm doing my math wrong. It's not the 3,500 kids. Sorry, I'll catch up. Just give me time. So it's not the 3,500 students at Granger. It's that percentage that live in poverty at Granger.
Yeah, so
correct?
So you could quickly, the modeling that I did of how much they would receive, you take the purple number for each school times 10, and that could be their allocation. Yeah. Very good.
So I want to make sure I understand this purple number. The purple number is?
The projected number of students in poverty, and that number would be used to determine their Title I allocation.
And what is the black number then?
Is their
actual
true number of poverty that, because we as a district choose to calculate poverty in high schools by the projected pattern of their elementary schools, that's how they can be different. And we choose that purple number or the elementary projection.
Why are they so different?
Often, you could think of it this way. It's the same families attending the neighborhood elementary school and the high school. High school students might not have as much motivation because they might not eat lunch and they might not see the merit of filling out a form. That's probably the most prevailing argument in why the two are different.
Okay.
Yeah, and it could be that as well, where an elementary child might not
So
be as cognizant.
this is a documentation problem, really. The gap shows a difference in people willing to fill out the documentation.
It
could also, like, I think about my income when my kids were in elementary, and it's different from when my income when my kids were in high school.
Sure. So yeah, when you say documentation, meaning their desire, willingness to fill out the form, right?
Yeah.
But something to keep in mind too is at any snapshot in time, the poverty level maybe should be the same in the elementary and the high school because presumably it's the same families that attend both, right?
Yeah, that's why I'm surprised that there's such a difference. I mean, it's double in most of those places.
Right.
The purple is double what the black is.
Cottonwood's a unique case because of that lunch grant. That's what makes Cottonwood so different, is because you're not only using the elementary numbers, But those elementary numbers are inflated because of this grant that'll go away in a few years.
Oh, I
That's
see.
why Cottonwood is so drastic. Granger's more true to form. Granger's about a 10% difference.
But they're also, I mean, Cottonwood has other feeder elementaries, and that's probably why that percentage, if that's what you're talking about,
Yes.
is percentage. Because
Cottonwood
they've
is
got
the Bonneville
Walker, they've
network.
got, or not Walker, Spring Lane,
Yes.
the other elementaries that feed into Cottonwood that are not, that don't
Correct.
have the high percentage. So that's what drops that.
Terry, I'm going to ask you to repeat what you just said into your mic, please.
Microphone, please.
So, if I heard you right, and I maybe didn't, okay?
Zoomers.
I'm speaking into my mic. Nationally, the biggest bang for your buck is coming from the younger kids.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. I'll share something anecdotal, then I'll circle back to research. But most people don't know one of my assignments is I am the principal of the teachers that we house in private schools, providing equitable services for private schools. So I have 2 teachers that report directly to me. And they serve, it's a targeted assist Title I model where they serve K through 8, right, in the same building. And I just mentioned to my teachers that I'm giving this presentation, she said, I teach K through 8. I can catch up a kindergartner, first grader, second grader, third grader like this. It's a lot harder and more expensive and takes more time the later on. So that's an anecdotal experience that speaks to what you said from the perspective of one teacher, right? But nationally, the reason why most districts in the country choose not to calculate poverty in this way, the purple way, the projected feeder pattern way, is because the trend is to focus investments in younger students for that same reason. It's the return on investment is higher. Now, it's not to say that money isn't good and that poverty doesn't exist in high school. That's not what we're saying. Certainly there's need there. But if we think of the experience of those that serve all grade levels and then research, yeah, it's more cost effective to divert research, or not research, resources into younger grades.
So if we catch them when they're younger, there may not be a need.
That's
as
the
they
theory
get
and idea. Yeah.
Do we have any data on our school specifically showing that?
So, I got a question about this prior to the board meeting, an informal conversation. One of my, I wanted to celebrate these schools, but the efforts of these 4 schools that are doing these things, right? It speaks to the reality that return on investment happens, but it's not, oh, I gave them this much money this year and I saw it the next year. If you read, there's some educational researchers like Michael Fullen, and they'll talk about to really make a difference, you invest doing these things, the right people, the right things in the right way, but it's not immediate, it's over time. Yeah. So we see, and what's exciting for me kind of forecasting, looking at our Title I schools, as we benefit from the collaboration of these principals, we see some schools doing the exact same things but it hasn't come to fruition yet. They're a little more behind on this journey. And so it's not so formulaic as this much of an increase and we see the gains or losses the year after, because there's so many other variables, and these are the variables, but because they're not tied or measured as much by the student outcomes at first, you measure them by implementation data, which is harder, but it's the right thing to keep measuring and keep track of. But in short, we're seeing progress in our district, especially in the Title I ranks, but it's more complex, so we can't make as bold of claims as we certainly want. And all districts in the country struggle with measuring things like they want to and having as definitive answers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question. As we talk about the 3 options, is there any way that we add more elementary schools into this? Or is this just to give, the percentage of money there? But how can we add?
How can we add some more schools?
Is there any way to do that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to put a pin in this slide, and, I went the wrong direction, I apologize. There's only a finite amount of money that we have, and that money has gone down. And so the federal rule set says any school that's over 75% poverty, we have to serve. And we can go down to 40%. We could serve about 50 schools with Title I funding if we wanted to, but they would each get, you know, just tiny. So could we? Yes. But again, the guiding principle is whatever we choose, the guiding star has to be, whatever schools we do choose, it has to be enough to close the learning gap. And it's...
So you don't recommend necessarily adding?
Yeah.
Elementary school right there, it's pretty well.
Right. And the reason I wouldn't recommend it is, in preparation for this meeting, I did a straw poll, and I said to our current Title I principals, I said, knowing what you know and knowing how fiscally responsible I'm asking you to be and the scrutiny that there is, tell me, in your school, what would it really take to close the achievement gaps in your building? And I got a dollar amount from all of them, and I won't share any, you know, names or amounts, but all of them indicated of this current list that they really could use more to do what they're being asked to do. And we didn't get into the weeds of what they would spend it on, but their judgment was good where I can see them, you know, they weren't asking for the moon, but I could see wisdom and discretion. So what I can speak to is the current Title I principals would think that they would need a little bit more to do what they're asked to do.
However, there is still this discussion of, well, so if you decided not to fund the high schools or to lessen their PPA,
Right.
I guess what you're saying is that all the discussion you've had is that it would be more effective to increase the PPA for those elementaries. Because, I mean, I'm looking at the difference between these schools. Their percentages are not that high. And so I look at fully funding a Title I project at one school and then another school that really does need that money, doesn't get any of it. I'm kind of saying, well, yeah, would it help for each of them to be 75% funded?
Yeah, so something to keep in mind is when we say increasing the PPA, so looking at...
Right, it doesn't really mean increasing.
What it means is declassifying the high school would get them back to what they were before the $1.3 million loss, right? And so it's not, unfortunately, in this conversation, there's no one option that gets us to the point where we increase to what they were. It's just defunding the high schools means we get back to baseline. The way that I frame it is, how do we want to distribute the pain? Do we want everyone to feel some pain, or do we want to localize it, depending on who can absorb it the best? That's how sorry, that was probably more, but strike that statement. But you're right. It's all, how much is enough, and what supports are we providing, namely me as the Title I director, to make sure the money's making the most difference, right? We're going to benefit from a strategic plan that'll hone in their efforts even further, but money can make an effect if we're doing the right things with in the right way.
And also, can you remind me about the ESSER funding? Did we allocate extra ESSER funding to Title I schools and then they used that to make up this difference? Or are they did they all get the same Title I,
Good
ESSER
question,
funding,
yeah.
and now they're using that towards that loss?
The timeline is important in knowing even why ESSER funding came into the equation, because we go through a staffing situation each year, staffing/surplus, and that happens before we know what Title I allocation we had. So we said, plan on not getting any more money, and so they said, okay, we'll plan on this staffing, and then the shoe dropped and we're down 1.3 million. And so the reason that we, and I'll answer the logistic in a second, but that's the reason why ESSER is even a conversation, is because the timing was off. Now, what we did is I worked with the directors of these schools, and I said, okay, if you're in a situation where you need to surplus and cut programming because of this $1.3 million deficit, we're going to take a close look at your plans, and we will allow you to access some of this ESSER funding by need. And many, schools did, some to the tune of 100,000, saying that that's how much I went down because of the 1.3 million. So it was on a case-by-case basis where each school received according to what the need was, according to all the budgets that laid out. But it was a real need to prevent that staffing or surplus from taking place or cutting programming. The hard part is when ESSER goes away and we're nearing that fiscal cliff, not taking any action or a change of action means, that the programs will be cut. It just depends on if it's in a few schools or a little bit for all schools.
And so am I assuming correctly that if we chose not to increase or try to get back to baseline, what we're looking at is staffing cuts, which means higher class size in these Title I schools?
Correct.
And pretty much
grades.
across the board.
Correct. And split grades and things like that. Yeah.
And this is tricky because Julie, I hear your point. Like you look at the cutoff and you always say, oh, but that next school is only, 0.05% off or 1.2% off. And kind of the tricky part of that is you can go down the entire chart that way and where do you draw that thick line? Because you're going to have to draw it at some point, and I think that's something that's really hard for board members to grapple with because, you're right. We are saying, okay, this bottom school gets this funding and the next school down doesn't get any. At the same time, we have to have a little bit of prudence to make sure that the money that all the schools above the line, it's enough money to make the difference and fill the gap. Because remember, the purpose of Title I is to close that learning gap that's there. So it's tricky.
And I think too, especially since we've been studying many of the schools who are at the top of this list, Lincoln, Olean Walker, Moss, Granite Park Junior, Wilson, Cottonwood High, they've all been on the boundary study, right? And spending a little extra time in those schools and realizing what that Title I money is doing for them it's huge. I mean, they don't have that 550 population, but they are able to sustain 3 to 4 teachers per grade. And it's just, I feel like I've witnessed what it's done for them, So you really recognize that this is powerful funding.
Yeah. Well, 8 of the 22 Title I schools actually reside in my precinct. And as I visit community council, it is a very common topic. Obviously community councils are talking trust land funds, but just these, Title I, because they'll put their different budgets. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've been involved in where they are trying to reduce their class size or not surplus a half teacher or things like that. So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, Julie. It does make a difference at the elementary level is what I've witnessed especially. Connie?
Yeah, the one thing that's an advantage being a Title I school is so many of the outside private people that are willing to help in a school, I'm sure by what they have in their rules or what they do, they serve Title I schools. So the schools like in my area that are extremely needy can't get the help because they're not Title I. So that is another advantage when you do have a Title I school, that other people will come in and are able to donate and willing to donate because of that status, so.
And Connie, I am so glad you brought that up because I think that's something that we can do as a district is raise awareness with our community partners that, yeah, these Title I schools need help, but this bubble down here, they aren't getting any help. And that would be a place where you could be really effective. But people don't know it. They don't know that this exists really,
So I noticed, I found this slide interesting that where you said how are schools spending their Title I allocations. And I noticed that the second largest category for the high schools was the professional learning. What specifically, is that AVID training? Is that, what specific professional learning are they doing?
When you, let's say that I'm a high school principal and I send teachers to an out-of-state conference, whether it's AVID in San Diego or other things, All of the costs associated with professional learning, so the registration fee, the hotel, the flight, the per diem, those are lumped into the professional learning cost because that's the intent. Now, with our 2 high schools, they're doing some contracting with third-party folks, right, to come in. But the biggest chunk of that $280,000 is the out-of-state conferences.
Is it mostly Avid, or are there other programs that we're
They
seeing be
did,
effective?
There was Solution Tree, I think for these 2 schools, I think they both participated in that in Las Vegas in June. They both have Avid training, so they would have sent a team there. And I think there were some other conferences as well, but those are the 2 big ones, is
Okay.
PLC and Avid.
Just wondering. The reason why is just because, as I've sat in the community councils with the high schools, also seeing their funding and knowing that they do, that they are able to use their other monies for that as well. So
And that's true. And what has always been the case is these 2 high schools, right now, they have 4 discretionary funding sources that need to tie to the statutory purpose, right? ESSER, which will go away, TSSA, Land Trust, and Title I. All 4 of them can fund professional learning in the same way.
Dr. Wilson, I feel like you're a very intelligent guy. And I wonder which of, if any of these 3, you would lean toward. Which of them would you feel like is the best place to put the money?
I'll
Not
frame
to
it-
put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I want to clarify that I asked the superintendent if he thought it would be appropriate for me to ask
Yeah,
that
no, that's fine.
question.
In terms of viability, if we try to meet the statutory purpose of Title I and have a guiding star be that purpose of closing achievement gaps, but in the most cost-effective way, absent of what, and it's not community against community, because we're talking about a Cottonwood or a Granger, we're serving all kids in that grade span. So we're not pitting communities against each other. It's more age against age. So, and you've given some good examples. Is a higher class size in a high school easier than a lower grade? Yeah. Is it quicker and more cost-effective to invest in a lower grade? It is. And so in terms of viability and cost-effectiveness, removing the 2 high schools is the lesser of the 2 evils because of their existing other funding that they have and the buying power. I mentioned a neat thing that they're doing with this CTE initiative, right? Title I has benefited these schools in kind of being that catalyst for good ideas, but they'll still be able to maintain a lot of the same programming. As a case in point, when another high school was caught wind of, wow, you guys are doing that, I'm going to join. So these 2 schools could still maintain this new CTE initiative because another high school is without Title I funding. The benefit, a main benefit of being a Title I school is you're kind of forced to do these evidence-based practices, but the mission of my organization is that we want all of our schools in Granite to do that, not just our Title I schools. So in terms of viability, the statutory purpose, cost effectiveness, option 3 checks those boxes, right? But you hate to, then you immediately think of, well, what's the effect of those that don't have a seat at that table? And there is some loss because they aren't given a Title I instructional coach for my budget. Could they prioritize funding and do other things? Yes, but they lose out on a good resource, but in all things considered, that checks the most boxes, it makes the most sense, it minimizes the loss. Is option 2 still viable? I think it would be viable or would have been viable if we didn't lose $1.3 million. And these remaining 26 schools, even if we do option 2, they still have to cut some things. There's still going to be some higher classes or split classes. So the culprit here is that loss, that 1.3 loss that is kind of forcing the issue.
And if we were to do option 3, the people who I think to is the people who were not there in our elementary schools, who maybe entered, maybe they were a refugee or an immigrant, or they came from another district or another state in high school and they're way behind and they need extra something to catch up. They didn't get that bridge in elementary. is there any sort of funding or resource or option for that group of people?
I'll speak to my limited understanding and perspective and invite others to join. But refugees have different needs, right? And so if there's language needs, we have a wonderful Department of Ed Equity that provides resources and training, et cetera, to make sure that the teachers in whatever school it is, high school, junior high, whatever, that teachers are equipped with that pedagogy to help those students, right? Having been the principal at Granite Park Junior, where there's a sizable refugee population, a lot of the partners that worked with us, it was irrespective whether we were Title I or not, right? So there's still outside groups that help. For all schools, we have services for students experiencing homelessness. So there are more funds and programs and opportunities other than just Title I. And keeping in mind, too, that where we still have TSA and Land Trust, in the case that you've described, they can do essentially everything Title I funding can, right? And so that's my initial thinking of other resources that are available is they're not left high and dry. There's other things that come into play.
Can I,
Go ahead, Terry.
means Rich told Julie it was okay to put Aaron on the spot.
That's
I'd like to
carte
hear
blanche.
from our superintendent, see academically now how you guys feel.
Fortunately, we've had this discussion internally as to what course of action would check, as Dr. Wilson has said, the most boxes. And it really, while there are trade-offs and we're navigating what those are and opportunities, we feel like moving to that option 3 provides a greater investment at younger ages to provide that. Now we're still gathering information, identifying. Part of this study session tonight is to hear what your thoughts are regarding what's been proposed, or not necessarily proposed, but been discussed, but also reaching out to the schools even more and speaking with our high schools to determine impact and effects. So for those reasons, that's where we're exploring our options, but looking at it again, checking most boxes at that option.
Go ahead, Clark.
May I ask 2 questions? One, I apologize for missing it. Can you remind us what the cause of the reduction in this year's funding was? Was that a federal issue?
Yeah, so Utah received $13 million less because with the pandemic, we have more people moving into Utah and a relative good economy. The crazy thing about that is even though we have the same number of people in poverty, maybe even more, relative to how other economies in the state, in the United States did, ours seems better. And so because the federal formula is relative to state versus state economy, it seems on paper that Utah has less poverty. We don't, but the formula works against us in that way. And so the state received $13 million less, and again, there's 41 districts, all of them got less, and Granite got 1.3 less, 1.3 million less.
My 2 is going to turn into 3 here, I apologize. So is there any foresight that either that formula could change in the future, that there could be an adjustment to bring that back in appropriate? Because like you say, that's a clerical issue that doesn't reflect the true nature of the situation.
No, and it's based off of census data, which isn't refreshed often either. So the indication I got from my counterparts at USB is we're not expecting it to go up anytime soon. If the federal government poured, billions of more into this, then sure, but that's not any horizon that I've heard of in the federal government. And the funding formula that has actually worked kind of for Utah for years is now working against us, and it's been the same formula that just because of the pandemic uniquely was terrible.
But if I may, I will say President Biden's proposed budget does represent a significant increase in Title I funds for next fiscal year, but that is all still to be determined. So even those numbers, while the formula does suggest that Utah does receive less, is still be determined as to what that impact may or may not be. Still to be determined, but there is at least a proposal on the table to increase Title I fund.
Can you tell us the anticipated timing of that resolution as to whether or not such increase in funding would happen? Who knows? If it's part of this next budget cycle, we'd know at a point certain, would we not?
Yeah, I would anticipate, Aaron, remind me, when do we receive our title allocation
So we get
amounts?
preliminary allocations like March/April.
I was going to say, it's usually the first part of April-ish,
Yeah.
but I don't have a firm date and as to when that will be, but it is late spring.
Later than we want.
Yep.
And do you know, at one point, it was the case in our district that high schools were not part of the Title I allocation. When did that change exactly, and do you know why it changed? What was the thinking at that point in time, and what has caused the shift in thinking as of today?
Yeah, and so it was before my time in this role, but from what I know is that it was exciting. The first high school that dipped their toe in the 9-12 model was Granger High School, and it happened during this rebuild. And so you had a very savvy principal at the time that said, I want Title I funding. How can we make this work? And there was this unexplored option to say, well, let's not, the rule set always has been, however you calculate poverty, it has to be the same. We said, we see that in this line item, we might be able to qualify Granger High School for Title I if we make this change, calculate it by your elementary schools. So that was the reason for the change, is we thought, well, this 9-12 model, we're uncertain about this. It's a new building. The principal has a good plan for it. And so we said, sure, let's do that. And that only funding one high school persisted for quite some time until, and the question you didn't ask is, well, why is this even more of an issue now? Well, it's because this wonderful grant that the Granite Park Network had, it artificially, what Cottonwood High School does is it leapfrogs like 30 other schools that if we choose to make Granger eligible, then because of this grant, Cottonwood is eligible also, taking more of that money. So that's the history of it. And in essence, as we're discussing these options, it's essentially saying to either classify high schools by their own poverty level, or we can simply choose to not fund high school with Title I funds. The caveat, though, is any high school, if their poverty exceeds 75% poverty, if more than 75% of the patrons qualify for free lunch, by federal rule set, we have to serve them. We don't have a choice in the matter. Now, if we look right here, Granger's at 47 and 58, depending on how you slice it. Cottonwood's at almost 40 or almost 70. I think for both schools, that would be their upper limit. So I don't know that any would qualify, but that's another rule set that pertains to Title I.
I do remember having this conversation years ago. Terry and Connie, I think you're nodding your heads as well. We grappled with this because that CEP lunch grant, by accepting that, you're then kind of tied into these high schools. And so it was really hard to deny the CEP lunch grant, which is awesome for this group of schools, surely because that kind of led to the high schools being included. That was years ago. I don't remember the fine-tuned details, but I do remember trying to reconcile that in my head of, okay, so we want this lunch grant, the CEP, but that's taken, that's putting Title I funds into high school instead of elementary. Anyway, Rich?
And Rick.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just to clarify, the word on the street is that it will receive significant funding. We have not seen, nor has been released, Biden's proposed fiscal 24 budget, but the rumor is that there'll be another significant increase in that, to be determined.
Clark, just historically, a couple other elements were in play when Granger first became Title I. One was, something to consider was TSSA was not around at that time. That pot was not available. We did not go as far down the line back then as we do now. So at that time, everyone was receiving quite a bit more, those who we were qualifying. Granger made a compelling argument as to the need that they had And when we looked at the amount of funding everyone was receiving and did the math, we felt like, okay. After that, we lowered the line a little bit farther and included some more elementary schools as well. So several variables over the last 10 years have come into play. John is going to say, just land trust continues to get higher over the years, just like TSSA will. Those investments and the compounding on those investments, we hope we'll continue to see those pots increase.
I'm so sorry to be the ignorant person in the room, but I would love an explanation of the lunch grant. I hadn't heard of that before tonight.
I know, I answered that through my lens as the Granite Park principal when our students benefit from it. So at Granite Park, if we base the poverty off of the number of students that are eligible for free lunch, it's about 90% or 80% or something like that, right? But what this grant says is, all right, school, you have a critical mass of need in your building. Everyone in your school gets free lunch. Even those 15 to 20% that really don't qualify, how great for them. And so there, you take away this, perhaps some social barriers, whatever, like no one's filling out the forms, right? It's just a free lunch for everybody, free breakfast for everybody. And so the benefit to a school is that even though the way that forms are filled out and processed doesn't give any indication who's on those, but any barrier or hint of that is removed, that we all just have lunch here, we all get free lunch, and it has a very positive culture in the building, and you see more kids eating and a breakfast, lunch, and we had even an after-school dinner, and that's true of the Granite Park Junior High and its 5 feeder elementaries, almost all of which go into Cottonwood. So it's a great program, but the consequence of that is Cottonwood High School's numbers become even more artificially inflated or more than you might expect because we calculate their poverty based on the elementary poverty.
Can you clarify one thing with the free and reduced lunch? Do they have to be citizens of the United States in order to qualify?
You just have to be enrolled in the school.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a question on the grant. Is it renewable every year, or is this a?
It's every
is it a-
4 or 5 years, and we're
Okay.
in year 2 of that cycle, I believe. I would hope that we would have it in perpetuity, but, and it is a federal grant, but when it expires, of course, if it's available to renew, we will through food services, right? But I think it's around for another 2 or 3.
So what you're saying is that because they're all receiving free lunch, the numbers look like they all
Yes.
qualify for free lunch.
Yeah, and those are the inflated numbers. It's essentially 100%. The math behind that, the black box, is there's a 1.6 multiplier,
Okay.
but in essence, all of the kids get it for free, but we count their poverty percentages for federal reporting purposes and serving Title I funds to those red percentages that
I
you see.
see. Okay, that all makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, just as a reminder, board, this is an info item. This is just study session, so there's obviously no action taken today. If we have a sense or a feeling that we do want to perhaps be willing to change course and look at this option 3 a little closer, we can put it on a future agenda as an action item. It doesn't tie us into having to do that action, but it gives us the option of making this vote. So, down the road. So I'm seeing a lot of nods. Are there any?
Is there a deadline, like a timeline we need to follow for this to?
Yeah, if we were to take action, in fairness, I'm not saying this is the direction, but if we were to look at option 3 and vote for that approval, that obviously takes funding away from 2 high schools. So in fairness to them and their plans, when would that,
Yeah,
what would be
so-
fair to them?
So the linchpin in all this is spring staffing. And it's not just the high schools, but if we are doing the status quo, reminder that we'll have to cut back even all the elementaries a little bit too, right? So by that spring staffing, schools need to know, the high schools, do they need to surplus their Title I coach? And then all the other elementaries need to know, is my funding going down by that percentage? So I think spring staffing, is that the first Wednesday in March? So that would mean that going backwards, a decision would need to be made in the February board meeting.
Or January.
Yeah, or yeah, I mean, the sooner the better, because obviously.
The more time, the better, I would
Correct,
think,
yeah.
for planning. Okay, but that's helpful.
All I'm going to say is don't foul it up, okay?
All right. All right, thank you, everybody, for your insightful questions. Good board discussion. Thanks, Dr. Wilson, for all your hard work on this and preparation. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And pass along thanks to your whole department, because I know
Will do.
you're the face of it, but
Yes.
I know there's a lot of workers behind you, so.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, we do have need of an executive session. Oh, shoot, I gave my paper away. For the purpose of, Doug, help me out, security personnel, no.
Personnel, security, and parents.
Okay, I have my paper back. Closed session for the purpose of deployment of security personnel devices or systems.
You motion, because I don't remember that. Give her the paper.
I'll motion that we go to executive session for the purpose of deployment of security personnel, devices, or systems.
I'll second the motion.
We have a motion and a second on the table to go into closed session for the purpose of deployment of security personnel, devices, or systems. This is a roll call vote. Let's start with Terry, if you'll state your name and then your vote.
Terry Bodden, yes.
Connie Burgess, yes.
Julie Jackson, yes.
Nicole McDermott, yes.
Chris Wynn, yes.
Clark Nelson, yes.
And Karen Winder, yes. We would invite the following people to our closed session as well. We would like our Business Administrator Todd, our Chief Porter, Doug Larson, Don Adams, Ben Horsley, and Dr. Knight. And everyone else will be excused.